not an easy thing to give your pulpit up to anyone. It's always done with prayer and consideration, and so I appreciate the trust that Art is giving me in giving me this time. The question that he asked me to answer is, how do you become a Messianic when you were a Methodist preacher? And that's not an easy question to answer. And I'll be honest, it's a little daunting too, because I'm looking back over 50 years, and I've got to take 50 years and make it something very condensed, because I don't want to drag you through all 50 years. I could do that, but I won't do that to you. The second thing is that I've been preaching for 26 years. So I don't like just talking about myself. If I'm going to be up here, I want to be talking about something that's in here. I want to be telling this story. I'm not used to telling my own story. I'm telling this story. But I want to honor my friend's request. So I'm going to kind of do both. I know, right? All right. So I'll start with a story that I actually identify with. That I identify with the story, and I identify with the story more and more as time is going on. And really, what I'm talking about today is about identity. What's your identity? Where do you derive that identity from? What drives that? What motivates the identity that you have? For me, I could take a look at this story. It's the story of Ezra and Nehemiah, and some of you are familiar with that story, but I'll break it down for those of you that aren't as familiar with it. The story of Ezra and Nehemiah really begins with what they call the sons of the exile coming back after 70 years. The sons of the exile coming back to the land of Israel to rebuild Jerusalem. But let's be clear here: the people that are returning are not actually the sons of the exile, not like the sons of the exile, the children that were going off to Babylon. These are the children of those children. These are the grandchildren of those children. In fact, the youngest child of the exile itself would be 70 years old. 70 years old in that day and time, and probably not in the health to make the journey back. We're talking about months of journeying back by foot or by caravan, trying to get back to the place where they started. So more than likely, none of the people that returned back to Jerusalem had ever seen it before. And even if they had been there once before, they didn't remember it. So you've got a group of people that are journeying all of this time to get home to a place they've never been before. To live out a life that they've never lived in that kind of fullness. They've heard the stories. They've heard stories that are soaked in grief, that are faded out by years. They've been taught in the shul, the synagogue that had its birth in that exile, where the people of Israel have said, wait, what happened here? Why are we not back home? And so they began to study that. And so out of those studies, some of those first studies these people would have had, and they would have been perhaps inspired by that to go back and to live that life out, the life that they ought to have been living, right? But they'd never lived it before. They'd never seen those walls before. They had never experienced what it would be like to walk into the court of the temple and to watch the sacrifices. They'd never experienced what it would be like to stand on the Mount of Olives and see the smoke coming up from the altar. They'd never experienced any of that. Their idea would be romanticized. It would be a faint image of what had been, that they didn't have any way of touching back to. There's no pictures, there's no internet. You can't look back to see what it was. So they make the journey. them and their children and their children's children make the journey to a home that they've never been to before. And if they crest the hill and they look down on it, it's just a ruin. It's a mess. They can't even get a picture of what it was like just looking at the ruin. It's gone. More practical concerns come into play. They begin to rebuild their homes, home and shelter. If you need shelter, you need food. They start on that. And then they get started the real work of the thing that they really wanted to get done so that they could live the life that their parents and their grandparents had talked about. Rebuild the temple. The people in the lands around them get together and decide this is not a good idea. We don't need Jerusalem to be a power again. And they shut it all down. And that's where we find them with Ezra and with Nehemiah. Their state is in such a sad place that it brings those two men to tears. Nehemiah is in tears before he even gets there. They're crushed. They have a vision of what should be, but they've never actually seen it walked out. They desperately want to be transformed, but they don't know how. I can identify with that. I was born into a family that is the American equivalent to gypsies. Some of you have heard me say I have moved 60 times in my life. Literally 60 times in my life. I'm not talking about the times that I traveled from one place to another and slept on a couch or something like that. I have moved 60 times. 30 times before I graduated from high school. I lived in places with such diverse points of view. California, Virginia, Arkansas, the Navajo Reservation. It was really outside my box. Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado. In my adult life, I've lived in Oregon and Pittsburgh, and if there are two more opposite points of view in the world, I don't know what they would be. And of course, here in the Midwest. I went to 17 schools growing up. 17 schools. My record for church hopping, my record for church hopping, it stands unopposed because I've lived in so many places. But my record for school hopping is 3 schools in a school year, 4 if you count it from January to December. It will be not a surprise to you that my identity is an outsider. I have lived most of my life feeling like a person that's on the outside looking in. And that's tough to grow up in. I think the hardest blow for me was when I was about to enter into my 7th grade year and my parents separated. That divorce was something that obliterated my entire world. Because at that point, my parents separated out, their relationship was gone, and then my relationship with them was gone. My father left for a year and a half. I didn't even see him for another year and a half. My mom became a person that I didn't know. And so at that point, going into my 7th grade year, I was now an outsider everywhere that I went. I repeated the 7th grade. Not a surprise there. Spent the next 3 years jumping from place to place, moving with my mom, moving to go out to finally live with my dad, going back and forth on Trailways and Greyhound buses. Just so you know, back then, Greyhound was the way to go. Trailways was a little sketchy. But I moved and moved and moved and moved, always feeling that outsider. When I moved my mom moved us to England, Arkansas. And when I was 13 years old, I went to a Landmark Missionary Baptist Church. That was the very first church that I ever went to. Landmark Missionary Baptist Church. I learned at the Landmark Missionary Baptist Church two things. One, hate all Methodists. I'm not kidding. And two, the only people that we knew were going to heaven belonged to our church. Even if they were other Baptists, still, a little hesitation there, right? I thought, having such a diverse background, I thought that I thought that was maybe a little too confining. But I went there. I went to my first church camp from there, and from my first church camp, I came back, and as is their tradition, I was baptized. So at 13 years of age, I was making a confession for Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior and being baptized, and I'm going to be honest with you, I don't know that I really knew what I was talking about. I felt like it was the thing that I ought to do, but I didn't really understand all the reasons why I was doing it. It wouldn't have been until I was 16 and we had finally moved to a place that I was able to kind of settle in for a little while. My dad settled us in there. By settled in there, I mean we moved 7 times, but just within the city. So I was able to, feel at home. While we were there, I decided that I wanted to go to church, but I didn't really want to go to a church that had its own, had a label, had a brand, because I didn't feel connected to any of that. And after my experience with Landmark Missionary Baptist Church of England, Arkansas, I wasn't quite sure that, trademarked church was the place to go. So I went to a little church called Gunnison Community Church. And Gunnison Community Church was an amazing place. It was the first place that I came into contact with liturgy. Now, for those of you that don't understand what a liturgy is, it's basically using ceremonies and repeated words, repeated phrases throughout a worship service. You do that throughout, every worship service has the same order of worship, has the same things that are said, and you change it up a little bit when you go from one season to the next. Now, for a kid the only thing that I ever knew was moving. The only thing I ever knew was different people. So I walk into this church and I find out that when you walk into that church, you don't just wing it. You walk into that church, you know exactly what you're going to do every Sunday, and you do the exact same thing. And the words are not just meaningful, they have been meaningful to people for the better part of 2,000 years. I was on board with that. It also is a place with creeds. And for a kid with ADHD, having a list of what you believe set in front of you, that was where I was at too. I didn't have to figure it out. I just followed that. The pastor there took me under his wing, and I began to read liturgy on Sunday mornings. I began to read the lectionary. That was another fun thing. I didn't have to wonder, well, what do we read next in the Bible? We had a lectionary. We just went through the cycle, and you had that all set out in front of you. It's great. So I began to help out with the worship services. I began to help out the pastor with getting the dressings for the sanctuary all done. It was great. I had a wonderful time, and I finally felt at home somewhere. So in the spring of that year, my dad moved. He moved all of us, and we took off across the country. Not a great surprise to all of you. It was kind of a surprise to me. And it was devastating. But I had found something. I knew there were other churches out there that were like that, and so I started seeking that out. And the process of that, it kind of created this thing in me where I was looking through all of the different churches. It created this new fascination, And so I started going from one church to another to see, what's up with all of this? Well, all of these different kinds of churches, what are they doing? And so, I went through the whole gambit of it. I went to, I went to a non-denominational church. That was kind of out of the box, right? But I went to the Pentecostal Holiness, the Assembly of God Church, two different synods of the Lutherans. Went to the Anglican Church. I even managed to squeak in the Roman Catholics, and of course the United Methodist Church. I had a grand time. Went to catechism with the nuns and the bishop. Had long talks with the Episcopalian priest. By the time I got into college, I went to a college ministry with the Lutherans. I helped the Baptists with VBS. During my senior year, I like to tell the story about my Sundays. Basically, were I started out with the United Methodist and Sunday school worship service. We were done by 11:30 so that we could beat the Baptists to the restaurants, because they got out at 11:45. And then I would walk down 5 blocks to the Pentecostal Holiness Church where my grandparents were at, and they were already 45 minutes into their service, and I had no idea what I was going to walk into, because they were just getting started. One morning I walked into the middle of the March to Jericho, and I took that march all the way around to my grandpa, who refused to get up and do anything like that. And then go home, eat something, rest for a few hours, and wrap up Sunday with the Baptists for evening worship. It was a busy schedule, but I still felt like an outsider. I still wasn't connected. The Methodist Church was the only place that I really kind of felt some resonance there, but I still hadn't completely gotten there. John Wesley inspired me, but I still didn't quite feel connected to it. So I graduate from high school, and I take off for college. I do 1 year of college with the Baptists, and that was interesting because I walk in there, I'm a Methodist, and I go to a Baptist Bible college. There was some tension. I wasn't quite ready for all of that. I kind of laid low with all of it, and I went there for a year, and then I took 3 years off. And in those 3 years, I learned 2 very, very important lessons. 2 lessons. The first lesson is bad company absolutely will corrupt good morals. And the second lesson that I learned was that alcohol dependency is an easy thing to develop if you have an alcoholic family. So, no surprise, by the end of the 3 years, I had lost every job that I had held. I was homeless, and I had lost almost all of my belongings. Slept on couch after couch until finally I was at the end of me, and I realized I needed to do something. So I get in touch with an Augustinian monk. And I have a conversation. This is great. I had a conversation with this Augustinian monk in the living room of my brother, who is a staunch Lutheran. He was not happy. And I tried to convince this Augustinian monk that was where I needed to be. He asked the question, "Did you complete catechism?" And I said, "No." I could get that out of the way, though, if that's a requirement. Obviously, he did not take me. I found myself at the end of me, and I decided to go back to stay with my mom. My mom encouraged me to go back to the college that I went to before, and helped me to get back on my feet. And the pastor there in town, he and his wife sort of adopted me. So I go through that summer, and it was the most transformative summer. Here I started the year out. Coming into January, I was an alcoholic that had lost everything. And by the time I get into the middle of the summer, I am studying the Bible and praying. I've got a job. I'm going to go to college in the fall. And my pastor comes to me and says, would you, I think that you should sit down with our Board of Ordained Ministry and talk with them about becoming a pastor. And I was floored. And so I go to that meeting. I'll tell you, I've never been more intimidated in my entire life. 10 United Methodist pastors all sitting around a table staring at me. I was so nervous that I had my hands in front of me like this, and I was grasping on with this hand onto this arm till this hand was cramped up, and I couldn't release. And then when we get out and we're talking in the hallway, I was talking to my pastor, Roy, in the hallway, and I'm like, Roy, I have a handprint on my arm. And at the end of that thing, we talked. They talked about what my background was. They talked about where I had been. They talked about where I was going. They talked to me. They wanted to know, what I thought about God, how I felt about the Bible, and what I thought about church. And I go through all of this stuff. These United Methodist ordained pastors, these men that I held in high esteem, and here I'm sitting in this room, and they're asking me questions, and I'm answering them. And then I leave the room. And Roy goes back in there, and they talk for probably a half an hour, the longest half an hour of my entire life, I think. And he comes back out, and he said, they've approved it. I belong. Oh, sorry. Being an outsider all your life, having somebody say that you're now not on the outside anymore, was a pretty powerful thing. So, I didn't know what that meant, though. I'll be honest with you. They said that, and I was like, okay, so what do we do next? So I go to a school for 2 weeks and to become a local pastor, to be licensed as a local pastor. And then I come back from that, and I don't have a church or anything like that. I go on to college. And I'm thinking, okay, well, Lord, that was great, but what now? Now I'm waiting. What's that all about? I don't understand, why am I waiting? Why am I going and doing this thing? And I learned the first lesson of waiting in my whole life, because while I'm sitting there, all miffed because I'm waiting, I go to Williams Baptist College. And the very first big activity that they have, I go there a little bit early because I've got a buddy there, and I stay with him before they open up the dorms. And then, and I'm just kind of hanging out there. Well, then the beginning of the school year starts, and they have the very first activity, and it's this assembly where people are doing a talent show and stuff like that. And I see up on the stage, in the only stage production that my wife has ever been in, this girl, and she was gorgeous. And so I spend the next month and a half trying to get around her and avoiding her all at the same time. I'll spare you the details, but in the end, she marries me.
Yes.
Yeah, I know, right? Yeah. Well, and it's hilarious. This guy that was trying to be a monk, who, when he got to college the second time, had affirmed with his buddies that we're all confirmed bachelors. We're not here to get a wife. We're here to learn about God and to get out there and preach the gospel. And I was not 2 months before I was engaged to be married.
Yes.
Thank you, Lord, for not making me wait that long to learn about what it was that I was waiting for, right? But I blow onto campus, and finally I'm finally in my own. I'm a Methodist. I am a licensed Methodist preacher, and so I hit the ground running. Within 3 weeks of getting on campus, I'm in the dean's office explaining to her why it was that I was trying to start a Methodist Bible study on the Southern Baptist campus. And by spring of that year, after a lot of other things that I pulled, a lot of other stunts that I pulled, I was being swung out into the mud pit volleyball pit to baptize me in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Kerplunk. I tried to explain to them I was baptized in a Baptist church, so I wasn't sprinkled, but they wanted to make sure. I get married in May, move into the parsonage in the end of June, and I start my career as United Methodist pastor. I'll make a long story short with that. I kind of moved up the ranks in it. I made all of the mistakes that you make the first year. I read my sermon. For the first 3 months, I read my sermon. And then I sat in on a service where the guy was reading his sermon, and I swore, I will never do that to anyone else again in my life. It cracked me up with Peter Cartwright when he was talking about that, and I was like, yes, exactly. No, he should not do that. I moved on to the second church, and I got involved in district youth ministries. I was the one that coordinated all of that stuff. And while I was at that church, it was a much more vibrant church, and had my own study and everything. And so I started studying about stuff that I hadn't really thought about before. I'd never been raised in a religious home. My family, my dad thought of God as the big spirit in the sky, and as long as you were happy, he was happy. My mom never talked about religion at all. In fact, the only thing as far as spiritual things that I had any connection to when I was growing up was that my parents both dabbled in the occult. So I had tarot cards and palm readings and all of that kind of stuff that was happening on at least a semi-regular basis. That was not unknown to me. I was familiar with it. So now here I am, and I'm supposed to be I'm the pastor. Do they know how much I don't know? So I started studying. And the very first thing that I hit upon, just kind of shooting in the dark, well, let's try communion. What's the background to communion? Well, part of it was that my wife and I started this Bible study called Disciple Bible Study. It was a great Bible study, really, really solid Bible study. But in the process of it, when they got to the place where the Exodus happened, they introduced you to the Seder. Not actually the Seder. They introduced you to the elements of the Seder. And they said there were some kind of important things about those elements of the Seder. And here's some general stuff about it. And they do it in a particular order, but they didn't give it to you. And then they said this line that inspired me and later irritated me. It's possible that the Lord's Supper was instituted during the Passover Seder. It's possible. I love that line because it personifies what the church was about back in those days. That they were acknowledging that, but they weren't. But they were acknowledging that there might be something there, but they weren't actually going right for it, right? And so more or less what they said was that you had one of two options. Because they said it's possible, but that he took these elements out and he made this meaningful ceremony out of it that we now celebrate. And so if you take that whole line of thinking that they had and you take it to its logical conclusion, they basically said that either Yeshua was like, when he came to the Passover, said, nah, bro, that's not my scene. And went on and just did this other thing with a couple of elements. Or he was like, yeah. Well, in the middle of this, let's do this meaningful thing. Isn't it neat that I did this meaningful thing in the middle of all this stuff that you were doing? But that's not what he did at all. He took something that had meaning and he said, no, let me show you a greater meaning. And then I discovered that the churches had been doing that. That's how they did Holy Communion. Of course, that kind of set me back. I'm like, how on earth am I going to have a Seder meal in the middle of a United Methodist service? This doesn't seem like it's going to work out so well. And so what we did was we had a Seder. We had a Passover Seder, and that started from the year before Alex was born. until this year, or through this year. Almost every single year we've had a Passover Seder, either a family Passover Seder or we've done one publicly. And so that was where it started. Well, of course, the next thing that you start digging around. Baptism. Where did baptism come from? That's kind of interesting. I want to find out more about that. Wait a second. Sabbath. Now that was a showstopper. Now, mind you, I'm thinking about Sabbath. I'm doing this Sabbath stuff somewhere around 95. So, how do I get from 95 to here? What happened in the process of all that? Well, when I'm looking at Sabbath, and really, I think for a lot of us, Sabbath is the very first point where we finally have to say, well, okay, this is going to start changing stuff, right? So I took a look at Sabbath, and I thought, what am I supposed to do with this? I have almost 2,000 years of history that I am upholding, right? Of ceremony and ritual, that I am the one that's representing that. How can I go against that? How can I look at all of this? Look at these guys. Look at them. Look around. Look around. Look at all these guys on the walls here. Looking kind of grumpy. You know why they're not? You know why they're grumpy? Hey, they aren't celebrating Sabbath. You're a little bit happier, I think. But these are the guys. I mean, these guys have been preaching the gospel and died long before I came around. How can I stand in front of them in judgment and say you're doing it on the wrong day? How can I stand in front of two congregations of 30 people, 60 people all together every single Sunday, and stand in judgment of what my own superiors said was the Sabbath day? Who am I? This outsider that they welcomed in to say that. On top of all else, that's my house. I live in a parsonage. That's my career. This is what I'm going to school for. So I admit to all of you that what I did was I hid it. I set it aside. I asked some questions, and the answer was convenient. Sabbath is what it means to you. Take your Sabbath when you can take your Sabbath. If that's Monday, that's great. Take that instead. You work on Sunday, so don't treat Sunday necessarily as your Sabbath. But all of your parishioners, they should treat Sabbath to be Sunday. All of the different answers that you get to that question, and I taught that. To my shame, I taught that year after year. I'll wrap up my my own self in this because I know I'm probably running late on time. I went to seminary. I moved my family to Pittsburgh to go to seminary. Mr. Rogers Seminary at that. Yeah. I know, right? And I served 3 churches there, and I would like to say that it was a beautiful day in the neighborhood, but it was not. Those 3 churches were the hardest churches that I've pastored. And when I walked in front of them and I said, hey, here are the Jewish roots of our faith, I had never before in my life, as much as I traveled, never experienced anti-Semitism. But I did that day. And so that was one half of it. Those churches were difficult, and from that moment on, I had a target on my back. And then there was the other side of it, which was my denomination. This denomination that had given me my philosophy and my theology, that had made me a part of who they were, the ones that I finally belonged. You know, I was now the insider, not the outsider. Those people. Well, in Arkansas, there are just some things you don't talk about. But when you get to Pittsburgh, they're talking about all of the things that are tearing the United Methodist Church apart right now. Those things didn't happen yesterday. Those things didn't happen the day before yesterday. Those things have been happening for decades. Those things have been happening since 1968 when they formed the United Methodist Church. And now it's coming home to roost. It's grown and grown and grown until it's literally tearing the whole building apart. And I was starting to have those conversations with the district superintendents there. And I realized when I was told, if you have a differing opinion, you should probably keep that to yourself. That the church that I had called home wasn't home anymore. So when I left Pittsburgh, I left the church that I had called home. I was an outsider again. And at that point, I lost my identity. You know, I had an identity as a husband and as a father, but all the rest of it just faded off, right? And so now I enter into the next 3 years. The next 3 years are terrible, horrible. My wife is such a blessing because she stood by me through that whole thing. I was torn down, torn apart. I went to my very foundations and threw all of that away. I stood as an atheist that had no faith left in himself or anything else. And I had to rebuild that. And when I finally regained myself, and that's a whole other sermon, but when I finally regained myself and my blessing of a wife had held the family together through all of it, as we finally get to the end of all of those things, and I start rebuilding my faith. Now, what am I going to rebuild myself as? What kind of identity am I going to have, right? And so I start getting back into the church, and I start pouring myself into the church, trying to build that identity. And then comes a phone call at night in the parking lot of a church, and I'm trying to get my buddy to come and be a part of the church, right? What time is it? 106? Trying to get my buddy to come and be a part of the church, right? And he's really hesitant about it, and I can't figure it out. And so I keep after him, and he was like, all right, since you really want to know, I need to ask you a question. When is the Sabbath? My historian, theologian brain screamed, it's a trap! Because there's no way I can answer that question. There's no way that I can answer that question because I know which direction he's going. If you ask the question, you know what direction that person's going. And I said, I kind of stammered around and well, Sabbath is what it is to you. And Jim, Russ, what day is the Sabbath? And then I said something that, in retrospect, is completely ridiculous. Well, in the Old Testament, I need to be beaten for every time that I ever said that in my whole life. Well, in the Old Testament, and Jim's like, let me stop you right there. And at that point, we have this conversation about Sabbath. And I remember coming in and talking to my wife after that hour-long conversation on the phone in the parking lot in front of the church that I was trying to get somebody to go to. And I told my wife, I said, yeah, I just had this really interesting conversation with Jim Gregory about the Sabbath. And I think I need to do some praying. And I did praying and I did studying. And, this time, before I had walked up to the precipice and I had all of this weight on me, what am I going to do? How am I going to represent all of this? And I chickened out. standing on the high dive, and I chickened out, and I made everyone get off the ladder so I could get back down, right? And this time I'm standing there, and all of the old stuff, but the enemy is saying the exact same stuff over and over again. I'm like, I've heard these words before. What, how can you do that? How can you walk away from all of that? How can you walk away from all of the history? How can you walk away from all of this stuff? What are you going to do with your children? I have one guy in his family that I know celebrates Seventh-day Sabbath. One guy does not a church mate. And I wanted a place for my family. I wanted a place for my children. I wanted someplace that would support my wife. I wanted someplace that's going to support my children. And now I'm standing on the precipice, and all of the words are coming. You know what? You do this, you start doing this, and before you know it, you're not going to be in that church anymore. How long are they going to put up with that? All right. You don't have a place for your family anymore. Yeah. No place for your children. Sure. But the difference was that this time I was willing to embrace being an outsider. Not because it was forced on me, but because I was doing it for God.
Glory to God. Amen.
And so this time, I just turned around and I smiled, and I stepped off. That was faulty. Now, okay, so, now I'm like, all right, so now I've done that. What now? I got one guy. All of a sudden, it was two guys. It was three guys. It was some families. And it supported that, and we got encouraged in it, and we went along, and then there came to be kind of a tough time when there wasn't so, some of those families fell away. Some of those families moved off. And there's no Messianic. Well, I didn't know anything about Messianic communities. I didn't know anything about Messianic networks. I didn't know that, my wife was like, hey, Russ, there's this place in Peoria. Maybe we should go there. And so, the rest of that story. So how does this tie in to Ezra and Nehemiah? Well, the people are all gathered they've lost everything. They need to be transformed, but they don't know how. And God sends Ezra. God sends Nehemiah. And it encourages them. And they see that, and they're like, God sent these guys. Now we have some people that can help us to figure this stuff out. But Ezra was overwhelmed by it. Ezra didn't know, he didn't want to put such a heavy weight on the people because the people have been wandering around doing stuff that they shouldn't have been doing. He didn't want to put that heavy weight on him, and he was crushed by the weight of what he needed to present to them. And they're like, they all come to his house and they're like, no, seriously, don't worry about it. Rise up, be brave, and just do it. Just get up there and tell us what the Torah says. And we are there with you. I was inspired by that because I find myself in that weird place where I am a part of the crowd and I am the Ezra. I have my own Ezras. Dan Botkin, you are an Ezra. Art? That's not to build them up. That's just to acknowledge what God's done for me through them. So now I'm in that place, and I am both saying that to those that have gone ahead of me, and I'm hearing God saying that to me. All right, get up, be brave, and just do it. It was a hard place for me to do that. But you know what? All of you walk a hard road as well. You have your very own precipice to step off of. So I guess that is my final thing to say to all of you. Get up. Yeah, get up. Come on, everybody stand up. Now, the rest of it, I can't really have you act out, but yeah. Be brave. Why? Because we have our God that is calling us. And for His sake, just do it.
Yeah.
Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I praise you. I praise you for all of the places that you showed up in my life. I praise you for all of the things that you did preveniently ahead of me, making the way before I even knew that there was a way to go. Father, I thank you for every place where you showed to me that I wasn't alone. Every place where you showed to me that I wasn't the outsider. Every place that you showed me where I could provide something for my family that was so much more than what I could have ever done on my own. I thank you, Father, that you replaced all of the things that I filled my life with to bring order with all of those things that bring meaning. And that is something that I can bring forth out into the world, that I can bring to my children, that I can bring to my wife, that I can bring to all the rest. I praise you for that. And Heavenly Father, I thank you for the work that you're doing in the lives of all of these people that are gathered in this room, in their journeys, and in their stories. All of the places where they felt alone, but they weren't, because you were right there with them. All of the places where they need to be brave, and you're giving them the opportunity to be brave. I thank you, Heavenly Father, for allowing us the opportunity to be your people and to be more than what we would be on our own. Grant us the wisdom. Grant us the strength. Grant us the courage that we may be able to step off into your unknown and trust in you, that you will bring glory to it all. We lift this up in the name of our Messiah, Yeshua. Amen.